Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the third and Future West webinar series, Managing Growth in the New West. I'm Randy Carpenter with Future West. For those of you who may not know us, we're a nonprofit based in Bozeman that works throughout the Northern Rockies region. Our mission is to help communities identify and create the future that they want. And we do that by providing people with the information, training, and technical assistance that they need to make smart, informed decisions on an array of conservation and growth issues. You know, I don't have to tell you that the challenges of growth and change, and that can come from people moving here or from exploding visitorship that we've been seeing, that, you know, how it's affecting our communities, our rural landscapes, and even our public lands has become, of course, a front burner issue. And while this is not necessarily a new thing, with the advent of the COVID pandemic and the pace of growth and change seems to be increasing by the day, and the impacts are becoming more acute. You know, there's some outstanding examples out there of people and communities taking steps to overcome these challenges from growth and change. But at the same time, we know these are incredibly difficult problems to solve. You know, as one county commissioner we know once said, managing growth isn't rocket science, it's more difficult than rocket science. You know, understanding these issues and the choices that communities have is the first really most crucial thing, understanding your choices. So that's why we've teamed up with a number of experts in the most important salient issues facing communities in the Northern Rockies for this webinar series. The topics in this series cover things like, you know, how do cities and towns coordinate their planning so our valleys aren't paved over with subdivisions? How do patterns of growth affect our wallets today and the long lasting impacts on our economies, and what can we do about that? What do we do about affordable housing? How can we conserve our agricultural landscapes? How do we replicate the best of old neighborhood design in new development? How do we strengthen our downtowns, which are vital to community well-being, and a whole array of other topics. So our goal in this series is to inspire and inform local actions by both governmental and non-governmental entities and engaged citizens. Some of these topics relate to rural land protection, others to urban growth and community development, but the important thing is that they are interrelated and form pieces of the Northern Rockies growth management puzzle, as we call it. Now, you may or may not agree with everything our presenters have to say, but we hope that these presentations will stimulate discussions in your community and lead to concrete action on the ground. So today, we are privileged to host Chuck Marohn, founder and president of Strong Towns, for his take on how maintaining the character of our communities and ensuring their financial resiliency need the same strategies. Chuck is a professional engineer. I think he calls himself a recovering engineer and a land use planner with decades of experience. And he's presented these strong town concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across North America. I've known Chuck for quite a while now, over 10 years, I believe. And I think of him as a radically practical thinker. He's certainly changed the way we approach community building at Future West, just like he's influenced thousands of people across the country. In fact, he's been named one of the 10 most influential urbanists of all time. Before Chuck gets started, my colleague Allison Berry wants to give you some direction on the Q&A portion of the presentation, which will begin immediately after Chuck finishes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Allison.
Thanks, Randy. Yeah, just a few housekeeping things here. I did want to let folks know that we will have time for questions at the end of Chuck's presentation. So you can type in your questions at any time into our Q&A panel. I'll try to keep my eye on the chat as well, but with your questions, if you could try to use the Q&A panel, that is the best spot to go. And before Chuck starts, we're just going to do a quick poll, which I will bring up now. And you can, I'll give you a few minutes to fill that out. And we just have a couple of questions that will help inform how Chuck gives his presentation and gives us a little bit more feedback for future webinars. So just another minute or two. We've got nearly half of folks responding. All right, thanks so much. I've got more than 2/3 of you responded, so I'm going to give you a few more seconds and close the poll. Looks like we have most people here are from Montana, and we have people from a range of professions: planning, community development, environmental, and more. And that, share the results with everybody. You can see. And with that, I'm going to hand control.
Oh, no.
You can go ahead.
No engineers.
Well, we have other.
Yeah, no other. It's all good. No, it's all good. If you can switch the screen so I can share mine, that would be great. Hey everybody, my name is Chuck Marohn. It's really nice to be here. I am actually from Minnesota, and I am in Minnesota in my hometown of Brainerd right now. I am actually in the Franklin Junior High School, which is, it was the Franklin Junior High School where I went to school in 8th and 9th grade. Now it is the Franklin Arts Center. So I have Studio 116 in the repurposed middle school. And it's about 6 blocks from our house, and it's very nice here in central Minnesota. I hope you are getting nice weather, because this has been kind of, I looked and we planted our garden on May 5th last year, which I think was the earliest ever. That was ridiculously early, but we had this long run of warm weather and the ground was very warm. It is May 12th right now, and we are not anywhere close to pondering planting a garden. It's been very cold here and very chilly. So I hope it's nicer out there. Let's get started. I am super psyched to share these thoughts with you. And I put together this presentation in particular because I think it will help kind of frame some of the issues that I know you're struggling with. And then we're going to leave plenty of time at the end to chat. Randy started out by saying, you know, this isn't rocket science. It's even harder. And I'm going to double down on that point, because there's a big difference between rocket science and what we're trying to do with community building. And it starts with this understanding of what a complex adaptive system is. We look and understand that a rainforest is a complex adaptive system. It has different flora and fauna. They all act independently from each other. They respond to different stress and different stimulus and different opportunities within the environment. When we look at the order of a rainforest, even though it has an order to it, we understand that that order emerges from these complex interactions. It's not an order that is imposed, at one that it emerges. This is a complex adaptive system. Oftentimes we don't fully appreciate how human habitat, especially human habitat of the past, has this same kind of emergent characteristic. In cities of the past, people would working independently of each other, do different things to respond to stresses and opportunities in the environment. When we look at cities of the past, we see that there is an order, yes, but the qualities of it, the qualities that make it a place are emergent qualities. They emerge from this complex interaction of many different parts. These complex adaptive systems are different than systems that are merely complicated, systems that are like rocket science, right? A Rube Goldberg machine is very complicated. In fact, the complication is part of the novelty of it. But we all understand that if you move one of these blocks or cut one of these strings, a Rube Goldberg machine doesn't evolve and change and adapt. It just breaks. It just stops working. If you think about an automobile engine, automobile engine was designed by some really, really intelligent people. But if you stress an automobile engine, if you push it beyond its limits, it doesn't evolve and become a toaster or a wash machine. It just breaks. It just becomes a failed engine. This is the fundamental difference between systems that are complex and systems that are merely complicated. Complex adaptive systems adapt and evolve and change in response to stress. Complicated systems lack that fundamental capacity. We understand that if a rainforest gets a little bit too much rain or a little bit excessive amounts of sun in any particular cycle, the rainforest itself doesn't collapse. It doesn't fail. It doesn't stop working. Different flora and fauna may take over. There may be a change in its structure, but it's stable. In a word, it is strong. Take a cornfield, give it a little bit too much rain in any season, a little too much sun, and it doesn't adapt and evolve and become soybeans or potatoes. It just stops being corn. It just fails to be good corn. Systems that are complicated may be designed by very smart people and may do something very well, but they are designed inherently not to adapt or evolve. They are, in a word, fragile. We see the same type of thing with human habitat. When we look at human habitat of the past, we see this complex adaptive framework, a framework that allows cities to survive and thrive and endure in times of plenty, in times of want, in times of struggle, in times of peace. When we look at our system today, what we recognize is that this is a pattern that is very, very good at doing one thing, replication, growth. But it lacks an internal capacity to adapt and evolve, to change, to become something new. It is, again, to go back to that word, fragile. When we look at emergent human habitat, we don't have to go back real far to see the way that this was done in cities. This is my hometown. This is Brainerd, Minnesota, the way it looked in 1871. We're actually going through our 150-year anniversary this year. This is the original city. And very much like, the cities of Montana, Wyoming, they were all kind of founded around this same time. A railroad stop, some people with some hopes and some dreams would throw up what amounted to some little pop-up shacks, right? There were thousands of these built across the North American continent, and a lot of them failed. When they failed, nothing horrible happened, right? A few people lost a little bit. They salvaged what they could. They would move on to the next place. But a lot of these were successful. All those random variables come together. There's the right people in the right place at the right time. And when a place like this was successful, it would grow in a very organic way. Think of a culture growing under a petri dish. It would grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. The more and more people moved to this place, the underlying land values would increase while the buildings were slowly declining. This shift in value would create this natural redevelopment pressure, where over a period of time, you would get this street that would evolve and adapt and become this street. This is the exact same street. It's Front Street in Brainerd. It's just 30 odd years later. And over time, as the city continued to evolve, as people continued to move here and underlying land values continued to increase while the properties, experienced different levels of decline, you would see, again, that incremental pattern of development, incrementally up, incrementally out, becoming incrementally more intense. These 2- and 3-story wood structures would be converted to buildings of brick and granite. This is what it looks like to build human habitat. And if we go back over thousands and thousands of years to cities around the world, we see this type of structure happening. We see this type of evolutionary approach, this incremental change over time. At the end of during the Great Depression, and particularly taking off at the end of World War II, we began to build cities in a different way. We began to treat them as if they were merely complicated, merely a collection of streets and pipes and zoning classifications and funding schemes that we could put in place and treat very much like a machine, very much like it was rocket science. Today, this street looks like this. It's a half-occupied wasteland of parking lots and underutilized buildings. And if we want to grasp in one image why my city struggles to make ends meet, why my city has all kinds of ongoing financial difficulty, understand that just in this little stretch of street right here, these 2 blocks, there's $500,000 of public infrastructure. Where is the wealth that is to be tapped into to sustain that investment? Where is the wealth that we are going to tap into to fix the street, to fix the curb, to fix the sidewalk, to maintain those streetlights, to put in and maintain the storm sewer, the drainage systems, the water systems, the sewer system? All of that are public investments in these 2 blocks. Where is that wealth? Well, the wealth used to be there, right? As part of that organic evolving system. That complex adaptive system. Well, the wealth was there. Now we have switched to a system that is merely complicated, and it's gone. It has disappeared. It is no longer in place. I think it's important for us to understand why we took this step, why we took this leap. If we look at human development patterns through this phase of development, up until really the Great Depression in World War II, what we recognize is that it was a balance between growth and stability. It was a balance between how much can we grow and how quickly can we grow, and how do we sustain our stability. If we go back to that idea of the rainforest, the inherent property of the rainforest that develops out of that complex adaptive framework is stability. How do we avoid becoming fragile over time? During the Great Depression, and really coming out of World War II, the largest fear that we had as a macro economy, as a nation, was that we were just going to slide right back into the Great Depression. At the end of World War II, when we demobilized troops, when we brought people home, when we said, the war is over, shut down those factories, there was this massive concern that we were just going to go right back into the depths of the Great Depression. We didn't, right? We solved that, and we solved that by shifting to this, a different version of America. And not only a different version of America, a different marketing brochure, a different approach to building cities in a sense. But the idea was that if we could create a growth machine, if we could turn our cities into growth machines, we could just input the tools, the ingredients of growth, and out the other end, we would get unemployment lowered, we would get jobs, we would get GDP, we would get tax-based growth, we would get all these things that were elusive to us during the Great Depression. And in fact, that's exactly what we did. We created cities and we transformed them into complex adaptive systems and we transformed them into what I think we should think of as kinetic growth machines, engines of growth and development. I'm going to show you a map here, a series of maps of Fresno, California. And I'm going to show you Fresno because I've got good maps of Fresno, but literally like any city across the US, and particularly in the regions where the people are listening to this today, this is going to be a very common experience. But I want to show you the way cities changed from this complex adaptive framework, this balancing of growth and stability in order to keep the strength of the community intact, into a pattern of development that was a kinetic growth machine based on just how much growth can we generate, how quickly. So here's Fresno in 1897. The yellow area there you see is the boundaries of Fresno. And I want you to watch how this changes over time. Here's 1909. 1922. Now we're in the middle of the Great Depression, and now we're at the end of World War II. What you've witnessed up to this point is that complex adaptive framework. There is horizontal growth, yes, but there's also vertical growth, and there's also buildings that are being redeveloped and becoming more intense. The culture underneath the petri dish, that organic type of process. Now World War II is over. We have a different theory of growth. We have a different use of cities. We are going to turn them into kinetic growth machines to drive our macroeconomy. And what happens is going to be very familiar to all of us. Here's the boundaries of Fresno in 1958. Now we get to 1970. Here we are in the 80s, the 90s. And then by 2010, you have something that looks like this. Now we are growing very, very quickly. We're creating lots of jobs. We're creating lots of economic development. We're creating lots of tax base and lots of transactions. If you measure the success of our economy with a spreadsheet measuring transactions, this is a great way to do things. By pouring money into infrastructure, by pouring money into growth programs, by subsidizing certain styles of development, we have been able to, in a very short period of time, generate lots and lots of growth. And if you do that accounting at the federal level, this type of approach has been very, very successful. At Strong Towns, we do our accounting at the local level. And at the local level, the conversation becomes a little bit more complicated, a little bit more nuanced. I know my friend Joe Minicozy was the last speaker that you had. Him and I, his firm, and I joined them for this project, worked on a project in Lafayette, Louisiana, where we went through and we took an accounting of all their assets and liabilities. I'm going to show you some of that work here in a minute, but I want to give you one little insight here that the data kind of jumped out to us. When we did that work, we had really good maps of their water system. And so we understood what their liabilities were at the end of World War II, 1949, when the map was put together, and then in 2015, when we did the study. If we look at that period of time, at the end of World War II, Lafayette had a population of around 33,000. Today, it's over 120,000. So they've had 3.5 times population growth, 3.5. It's a huge amount of growth over that period of time. They have been one of these cities that has expanded very robustly. But when we go back to the end of World War II and we say, all right, what did it take to provide clean drinking water to people? At the end of the Second World War, it took 5 feet of pipe per person in the city of Lafayette to provide that service. Today, it takes 50 feet of pipe per person. That's a 10x increase. What did it take to provide fire protection for the people of Lafayette? If we go back to the end of World War II, what we saw is that it took 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people. Today, it takes 51.3. It takes 21 times that amount. And so we look back and we recognize that in a prior development pattern, we had much less resource use per person than we do today. We've grown our population by an aggressive amount, 3.5 times. But in order to have that growth, in order to experience that growth machine, it has required us at the local level to grow our liabilities by 10 times and 20 times. This pipe is now something we have to maintain. This hydrant is now something we have to fix and repair and replace. And so the question becomes, is this a good trade-off? I think people would say, well, Chuck, we're way better off today. We live in bigger homes. We have bigger cars. We have more luxury. We have more stuff. And so we are way better off as a society. And that's reflected in these numbers. Yet when you step back and you look and say, well, okay, we grow our population by 3.5 times. We grow our liabilities by 10 times and 20 times. How is our community actually doing? What we see is that on an individual level, on a family level, on a small business level, we're hardly growing our incomes at all. It is not kept up with the liabilities that we have taken on. When we look at families in Lafayette, and we look at families across North America, what we see is that the median family is experiencing long-term stagnation, a lowering of their net worth, and are actually becoming poorer despite the growth that we have been able to create and the rapid amount of expansion we've been able to experience in our cities. I want you to understand why this is happening and what this, the difference is between the complex adaptive growth framework and the kinetic growth machine framework. The difference between, as Randy started in the beginning, rocket science and community building. These are two identical blocks in my hometown, actually just slightly up the street from here. My building that I'm in is just off screen left here, if you're looking at this. These are two identical blocks. If you look at them, they're the same size, they're the same area, they have the same amount of public infrastructure. Everything about them is the same, except for the style of development. That block on the left, in fact, all three of these blocks here, the two, I'm focusing on the one in the middle, used to look like that block on the left. In the 1920s, as my city was growing organically, that incremental process, the next increment of out, the far outskirts of town, were these three blocks. And so what you're looking at here in that diagram on the left is the pop-up shack equivalent of the 1920s. I showed you that 1871 pop-up shack. This would have been the pop-up shack on the far outskirts of town. And the people who built these at the time assumed, because they had seen this happen in cities for thousands and thousands of years around the world, they assumed that if they built this little building, eventually more and more people would fill in this neighborhood. The neighborhood would become a more desirable place. Land values would go up. Eventually, these sites would have second and third stories. The buildings would become more intense, more ornate. That is kind of the natural organic development pattern that people at the time would have been used to and would have experienced and would have known as like the way things are done. Of course, that's not the way things unfolded. These were built in the 1920s. A decade later, we had the Great Depression. Then we had World War II. Then we have the kinetic growth machine and a completely different theory of how we're going to create success and prosperity at the local level. And we just started building, skipped right over these three blocks and started building out on the edge. This area has stagnated for almost a century now. That block on the right used to look just like the block on the left. The city labeled it blight, got it torn down. And now we have the new Taco John's drive-through, which I point out to other parts of the country who don't share Taco John's experience the way we do. I know everyone on this call knows what I'm talking about with Taco John's. I explain this to people like in the South as Norwegian Mexican food. And that seems to convey exactly what's going on with Taco John's. Here in Brainerd, everyone was thrilled about getting Taco John's. We were very excited. We got rid of blight. We got a new building that met our codes. It met our building codes. It met the fire codes. It met the ADA codes. It has enough parking spaces. It meets the sign regulations. We even put some green space in there to soak up stormwater. This met everybody's checklist for what we were trying to accomplish with this growth project. The problem, this was not a problem that anybody involved considered in any way, is that old and blighted block has a total value of $1.1 million. That shiny new block, the Taco John's on the right, it's the same size area. It's the same amount of public infrastructure. It's the same cost to the community to provide ongoing service and maintenance, has a total value of only $600,000. There's actually 78% more wealth in that property on the left. And because we fund our government here by property taxes, the old blighted rundown properties on the left that the city is actively trying to get rid of actually pay 78% more in taxes than the Taco John's on the right that is brand new that we tried so hard to land. We systematically devalue our communities in pursuit of growth, in pursuit of the transaction. And this is really what I want you to focus on. In communities of the past, in complex adaptive systems, in order to build that stability, what we are doing is we are building wealth, we are building capacity. And that capacity shows up in the finance. It also shows up in other places like community cohesion and our capacity to work together and many different dimensions that are harder to measure. But in terms of the finance, it's very easy to see. This block on the left is designed in such a pattern that it would magnify all of those things, including the financial productivity, including the capacity of this block to start small, to continue to grow, have great upside potential in terms of its wealth creation, but as you can see, have limited downside potential. What we see in the block on the right is something that in terms of the macroeconomy today, if you're an economist sitting with a spreadsheet in Washington, D.C., this looks like growth. It created a transaction. It hired people. It created jobs. It needed materials. It shows up on all the spreadsheets that you're trying to track. But from a community standpoint, it actually lowers our capacity. Not only is that a building that would not be expected to last more than 15 or 20 years, but it's on a site that is very difficult to adapt, very difficult to change, very difficult to evolve into something else. And financially, from a productivity standpoint, it is far, far less than the stuff we built. Even brand new pop-up shacks a century ago with a century of decline attached to them. This is a compelling case study, and I show it because it does allow people to anchor on something that they have experienced in their communities. But this is in no way, an isolated case. This is actually a broader trend. I know that Joe showed you some financial productivity maps because this is his work. We have shared a lot of stuff back and forth. I'm going to take his narrative and kind of tie it into mine now. Because what I'm going to show you here are some maps of financial productivity, taking that Taco John's and Old and Blighted block and showing you what this looks like across an entire community. You can think of a farmer going and planting seed across a field. The parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, those are the parts of the field we say have the greatest productivity. It's where you get the most like bushels per acre. When we look at a city, we ask the question, where do we get the most value per acre? Where do we have the most financially productive land? This is Buffalo, New York. I start with Buffalo because Buffalo has experienced, almost a century of decline. They've lost population every year since the end of World War II. It's been just a steady downward decline. If you ever get a chance to visit Buffalo, go. I like Buffalo. I've kind of got a soft spot for it. It has some beautiful, beautiful old homes. But Buffalo has suffered from decline and neglect, and it shows when you go there. Yet, when we step back and we do the math on Buffalo and we say, where is their wealth? Where is their most productive parts of their city? You can see here, the farther up in the vertical is the more productive it is. What you have there in the core downtown is that traditional development pattern, that stuff that was built before the Great Depression, that stuff that was built like that culture in the Petri dish, that complex adaptive system. Everywhere where we see that, we see great levels of financial productivity. Everywhere where we get into the kinetic growth machine, not only is it far, far less productive, but it's dramatically so. There's really is no comparison. This is a trend we see in city after city across North America. Joe's group at Urban 3 has modeled hundreds, they may be in the point where they've modeled thousands at this point, of cities. And whether it is a large city or a small city, whether it is a coastal city or an inland city, whether it's a northern city or a southern city, whether it's a city occupied by very wealthy people or very poor people, we see the same pattern over and over. Everywhere where we have that complex adaptive system, that pre-Great Depression pattern of development, that pattern that was developed incrementally over time, we see tremendous amounts of financial productivity. And everywhere we see the post-war pattern, in fact, the further we get away from that pre-war development, the lower the levels of productivity go, and the more financially constrained and stressed the neighborhoods ultimately are. This is going back to Lafayette, Louisiana, which I gave you the data on their water system before. This is the culmination of that study that we did, Joe's team and myself in Lafayette. What you're looking at here is not a map of financial productivity. This is actually a map of annual cash flow. So you can think of this as the annual profit and loss statement for the community of Lafayette, Louisiana. Everywhere you see blue is a property that pays more in taxes and fees on an annual basis than it requires in ongoing service and maintenance. And everywhere you see red is the exact opposite. These are places that require more money annually to provide service and maintenance to than they pay in taxes. And the higher the line goes, the more that disparity. Of course, the blue area here in the middle, the most profitable part of the community is the core downtown. To the right of that, to the east of that, there's a crescent of blue that runs through there. That crescent of blue are some of the poorest neighborhoods in the community, very profitable. They actually pay in taxes more than they require in services. Here's what these areas look like. So just to give you a sense from like an eye test, we're not talking about places that are outwardly prosperous. In the upper right, you have the downtown of Lafayette, a nice place. I like Lafayette, Louisiana. If you want a cheap taco and a Zydeco band, it's a great place to hang out. But no one goes downtown and takes photographs and sends them around. It's not a gorgeous place. It won't be on any postcards anytime soon. They are struggling in many ways, but one of the ways they're not struggling is financially. They're actually subsidizing the rest of the community. There's more tax revenue that comes out of and more fees that come out of that neighborhood than they require in ongoing service and maintenance. The same is true about that neighborhood I'm showing you in the bottom right. Obviously, very, very poor. It looks poor. It is poor. There are many poor people that live here. Just so we're clear, our analysis assumes that the city is out maintaining the roadways, maintaining the ditches, fixing the sewer and the water systems, providing police and fire protection, doing all the things that they said they would do. The fact that visually it's kind of obvious that they're not doing that only would make the analysis more skewed than what we're showing it. It would actually just make the blue line higher because it reduces the cost. This poor neighborhood is subsidizing the rest of the community, despite how it looks when we add up the tax base, when we look at the revenues that come from these neighborhoods, and then look at the cost and the expense of providing these services. The city makes money on this. It's net positive. All the rest of this stuff is red, net negative. And this is stuff that visually would be very familiar to us because this looks like growth. This looks like the types of things we pursue in order to, fulfill that kinetic growth machine, in order to experience that. It's the big box stores, it's the strip malls, it's the gas stations, it's the drive-through franchise restaurants, it's the windy cul-de-sac streets with the large suburban home. All of this stuff in Lafayette is out on the edge. It's all in red. The median family in Lafayette pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. In order for the city to maintain everything that they put in place, to fix all the roads, fix all the pipes, provide the police protection and fire protection and all the services that people expect when they move to and invest in a community. In order to do that, the taxes for the median family would need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. 1 out of every $5 that a family makes would need to get sent back to the city just to maintain what they already have. This is not going to happen. And there's no possible way that it can happen. And so Lafayette finds itself in a position where they have to decide, what road do we maintain? What road do we let fall apart? What pipe do we fix? What pipe do we walk away from and abandon? What neighborhood do we keep? What neighborhood do we say goodbye to? Lafayette is not a poor community by American standards. It is not a community that you would look at and say is impoverished or is struggling. But when we look at their balance sheet, when we look at their profit and loss, when we look at where they are, they have enormous liabilities in the ground as a result of decades and decades and decades of growth that is not productive, that is not actually paying off for them, that is not actually giving them the wealth and capacity to make good on all those obligations. So even though it is a place that has experienced a lot of growth, and even though it's a place that has, well-run government and fiscally responsible and all those things, they are nowhere near having the capacity they need to maintain their core basic infrastructure systems, let alone any of the other things that people have come to expect. And you already see this having an impact. If this sounds a lot like a community that you have heard of, there's a lot of people that ask me about Detroit, and maybe I will preempt one of the questions about Detroit that I often get by answering it now. When I talk about Lafayette and I say they're going to have some neighborhoods they keep and some neighborhoods they walk away from, that's not a choice as much as it is a consequence of their policies. People often look at Detroit and think that Detroit has made a lot of bad choices. And while indeed they have, a lot of it has been not choices so much as consequences. Detroit is really the first major city in the US to experiment with this kinetic growth machine. In the early 1900s, Detroit was one of the wealthiest cities in the world. It's on a major waterway. It had all kinds of industry. Detroit, if it wasn't the wealthiest city in the US, was certainly one of the top three. You can go to Detroit today and you can go visit the Opera House and some of these other buildings that were built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and you will be blown away with the opulence and wealth of this place. Detroit, though, as they were becoming the Motor City, became the first city to really experiment with this kinetic growth machine. They kind of developed the model. So they were the first ones to run highways through the middle of the neighborhoods. They were the first ones to have a commuter culture where people would live out on the edge of town and then drive in. They're the first ones to start tearing down buildings to make this happen, to really grow horizontally and give up on the other components of that complex adaptive system. And so when we got to the Great Depression and World War II, well, cities across the US kind of hunkered down and experienced a lot of distress. Detroit continued to have growth and prosperity. They were in the very kind of early stages of this development pattern. The bills had, in a sense, not come due yet. And everybody kind of understood this. And so by the time we got to the end of World War II, it was very clear to mayors and chambers of commerce and politicians and what have you around the country, if you wanted your community to be successful, you should imitate the development pattern pioneered by North America's most successful city, that being Detroit. And that's what we did. Detroit's not some like weird, strange anomaly. Detroit's just 2-3 decades ahead of everybody else. Detroit just took its solid, complex, adaptive, productive development pattern, spread it out over a huge area, driving up their costs. And, like all bankruptcies, it happens slowly and then all at once. That is the story of Detroit. And without some type of conscious change in our development pattern, that's really the trajectory that almost every city in North America is on today. How do we start to change this then becomes the question. And I think the question that I want you to struggle with, and I think we should all struggle with to a degree, because what we're really talking about here is getting our feedback loops back, getting the complex systems back, starting to build strength in our communities again by having them respond in ways that they naturally responded in the past, breaking out of this kinetic growth machine. And the first step in doing that is to allow our cities again to start to evolve. We talk about this at Strong Towns by allowing everywhere, always, at all times, the next increment of development intensity by right. The idea that we would lock neighborhoods, freeze them in amber or put them under glass and treat them as a museum piece where they would never change, evolve, or adapt. That mindset has to go away. It has to go away very quickly. We need all of our neighborhoods to continuously be adapting and changing and becoming more productive over time, the way organic cities of the past did. There's a little catch to this, though, and I think it's a very important one. And it comes down to this insight here, which is one we repeat often. A good, strong town in a place that's trying to become more prosperous, no neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood should be exempt from change. We often today strike this bargain with ourselves, not really understanding the deep damage it does to not only our community finance, but lots of other parts of our critical community life. We will take and we'll say 95% of our city, we're going to put under glass, and you never have to change and never have to experience any type of stress or trauma or discomfort with having your neighborhood evolve in any way. We will ensure through zoning and other code regulations that you will stay the same. But then we're going to take 5% of the city, and that part of the city is going to experience radical change. It's going to be completely unrecognizable. In a sense, there is a sense that, on behalf of everyone else, this neighborhood will be sacrificed, or this place will be sacrificed to this radical change so that we can all experience growth and what have you, and not have to have any change. This is a deeply unhealthy way to develop. No neighborhood should undergo that radical level of change, but every single family home neighborhood should be able to evolve into a neighborhood of duplexes with the minimal amount of regulatory friction. Every neighborhood of single family commercial, single story commercial should be able to evolve into 2- and 3-story levels of commercial very easily. The thing that I would resist is the idea that a neighborhood of single family homes should suddenly have a 4-story apartment building, or single family commercial should suddenly have an office tower. Those are the things that do damage to not only the underlying finances, but really that organic development process that drives those feedback loops and makes our communities strong. In order to get the growth that we want, or in order to get the feedback loops that we are trying to create, in order to get the type of incremental investment that are going to make our cities stronger, more productive, and more prosperous, we have to intentionally lower the bar of entry. We have, through all kinds of, I think we can ascribe noble motivations. I think we can also ascribe nefarious motivations if we look hard enough. But I think if we want to be generous, we can ascribe noble motivations. We have raised over time the bar of entry to fully participate in society. If you want to fully participate in society, here's the things you have to do. And, one of them is you need to get a 30-year mortgage, right? You need to be able to have the type of job and the type of income and the type of lifestyle that will qualify for and then support for decades a 30-year mortgage. This is not a bar of entry that people of the past experienced. In fact, in my neighborhood today, right outside my office here where I live, we call this a tiny house. Our ancestors would have called this a house, right? For some reason, we have put the adjective tiny on the front of this. And we've said, if you want to build a house that is smaller than other houses in the neighborhood, what you need to do is you need to meet all the requirements of a house, plus all these other requirements. Plus, you have to go in front of a board, beg permission. We're going to notify all your neighbors. You have to genuflect in the right way. And if you go through all this process, maybe then we will allow you to build what is, in a sense, a starter home, right? It's just a smaller house. Like I said, our ancestors around the world for thousands of years built starter houses. And the way they would build them is they would build very small place. And then as they brought in a little bit more cash, built up their own capacity, they would do a little addition on the back. They had a kid, they would put a second story on. The neighbor would come over and help. They would come over and help them. This is a traditional building pattern that's been with us for thousands of years. We have made these very difficult and very illegal to build, even though they are like the base level of entry. We need to lower the bar and allow this kind of thing to happen. There's a commercial equivalent of this as well that we can do. This is a shot from Muskegon, Michigan. Muskegon is a city that rapidly industrialized after World War II and experienced a lot of decline, had a downtown that experienced a disproportionate number of vacancies in their commercial properties. They would go and say, where's the entrepreneurs? Where's the people who are going to start businesses? They don't seem to be anywhere in the community. But when they dug into it, they recognized that in order to get into one of those buildings in the downtown, you had to bring it up to building code. You had to put in a sprinkler system. You had to put in ADA compliant bathrooms. You had to do a bunch of things that are very important, things that we as a society want done, but things that if you're a startup business, all of a sudden you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars of capital just to open the door. And it was too much risk for people in the community to take. So what Muskegon did is I said, let's lower the level of risk for startups. Let's make it easier for people to get going. And so they went out and bought a bunch of storage sheds. They filled in a gap they had in their streetscape with these. So they lined them up, they painted them funky colors, and now they rent them very cheaply to startup entrepreneurs, right? People who are just getting going. And they do this because then the person can focus not on how do we do all this construction? How do I manage a loan? How do I get stuff going? But they can focus on how can I make my business work? And let me say this in a different way, particularly in our smaller communities where entrepreneurs and startups are such an important part. How do I do something that is of such value to my neighbors that I can make a living doing it? That's what is being created here. And the amazing thing about lowering the bar of entry and allowing people to come in is that if you go to Muskegon, Michigan today, the downtown is full. It's full of businesses. And a lot of those businesses are people who got proof of concept in this little startup mode. And once they were able to develop their business and prove that it would work and have the confidence, we're able to move into those more expensive places downtown. We lower the bar of entry. We allow more people to participate in building our city. The last thing I want to give you as a way to get started, besides allowing the next increment of development, lowering the bar of entry, is this idea of now shifting our capital investments to respond to how people use the city. If we go back to those pictures of Fresno, I showed you how the kinetic growth machine kind of grew outward. And you can think of this, and the analogy that I have in my head is like an emaciated person, someone who has all the structure of a place, but just not enough meat on the bones, right? It's just emaciated, needs sustenance. And so when we look at our cities, we really have this kind of emaciated framework. We have a framework in place of roads and pipes and sidewalks and what have you, but it doesn't have enough meat on the bones. It doesn't have enough there to actually sustain itself, to actually be viable, to actually be productive and strong. The way we solve that problem is not by building more. It's not by empowering the same people who are kind of designed in this kinetic growth machine to repeat the pattern over and over again. It's to actually go back and say, how do we make better use of the stuff we already have? How do we take this framework that we've already built and thicken it up? How do we put meat on the bones? How do we get more out of it? We don't get more out of it by doing the same thing and by using the same approach. We have to ask a different set of questions. We have to ask a question about how people are using the city as it has been built and how we respond to the stresses and opportunities within that framework. At Strong Towns, we've created a 4-step process for making capital investments in the community. I'm going to go through that right now, but literally what we're talking about here is shifting our budgets at the local level from growth and investments in new infrastructure and new projects and new things that will create and generate growth to going back and maintaining well the things that we have built already and obsessing really about maintenance, while also having a portion of our budget going to thickening things up and making things better with this 4-step process. So let me walk you through this process. Step number 1, humbly observe where people in the community struggle. Go out and humbly observe where people are having a difficult time using the city as it has been built. I'm going to emphasize here the word humble. You don't want to go out with preconceived notions. You don't want to go out with preconceived ideas of what you're going to see or what you're going to experience or what you know to be true. What you want to do is you want to go out and to the extent that you can, walk a mile in someone's shoes, observe where they have a difficult time, walk next to them, have them talk about their life, where they're going, where they've been, help them point to you where the city is not working for people in the community. Step number 2, then, ask yourself a question. What is the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? You're going to have to resist the temptation to solve the problem comprehensively. You're not asking the question, what is the big state grant we can do? Or what is the big program we can initiate to solve this once and for all? You're asking a question, what is the thing we can do with cones and paint and duct tape and a shovel and some sweat equity to not fix this problem, but make it a little bit better for the person that is experiencing this hardship? The 3rd step then is to do that thing. Do it right now. Don't study it for 6 months. Don't form a committee. Don't have like some long drawn out process. This is just a very little thing you're doing. You can easily undo it if it doesn't work out. Just go out there and do it and don't waste a lot of time. And then step 4 is to repeat this process. Repeat it over and over and over again as your neighborhoods thicken up, as your neighborhoods become more responsive to the people that are there. What you are doing is creating what Jane Jacobs calls a process of co-creation. In the kinetic growth era, we have paid our taxes and passed our policies and kind of delegated city building to a core group of technical professionals. That has not worked. Cities of the past were co-creations, things that we built together. And in this process that I've outlined here, the co-creation comes from cities, humans living in cities, experiencing their lives, and the public sector, the people who are building them, responding to their struggles, using that process to kind of reveal the next struggle and the next struggle and the next struggle in an iterative process of co-creation. If we can humble ourselves to do this, we can make very cheap investments, money-wise, very low-cost investment money-wise, that have enormous financial returns. We can make very low-risk investments that have very high financial returns. We can continue down this kind of route here. And I hate to pick on Lawton, Oklahoma, because they were very kind people. But Lawton, Oklahoma found a federal program that would help them build a streetscape. And so all of a sudden, every problem that they had as a community became a problem that could be solved with a streetscape. And so they went out and they got tens of millions of dollars of federal money. They built their nice streetscape. They've got the nice lights. They've got the nice crossings. They've got fancy sidewalks in places. They've got benches and planters and all that. What they don't have is people and growth and success and prosperity, because they didn't start with the struggles that people were experiencing. They started with what they thought it should look like when it was done. Or we can take a different approach. We can humble ourselves the way they have in a city like Memphis. This is a little project in Broad Avenue where they did humble themselves. They went out and said, where are people struggling to make good use of this space? Where are people struggling in this neighborhood? And with some paint and some cones and a little bit of effort, they did a little bit of project. They did a small project that was a catalyst for a broader neighborhood rejuvenation. This little project, which literally cost the community, the city, nothing, was initiated by the residents out here, has now been made, incrementally been made permanent because of the massive amounts of success that was seen by bringing people together and by responding to their needs. Just one last thing, and then we'll do questions. We've got a book that we put out October of 2019 called Strong Towns. It goes through a lot of what I've gone through today, only in more depth. We have another book coming out in September. This one, the first one was on kind of the Strong Towns ideas and finance of cities. The second one coming out this September is going to be solely on transportation. It's available for pre-order right now if you would like to get a copy. And then our website, strongtowns.org. We started out as a blog back in 2008. We publish 2-3 articles every weekday. We do 3 different podcast streams. We do video quite frequently. We're active on all social media channels. What we are trying to do is to share these ideas with as many people as we can, and then support their activities to bring about change. So on our website, you will find the Strong Towns Academy, which is a free 101 course for people to take. You can take that, you can share that with your neighbors and all be kind of on the same page. We also have a thing called the Action Lab, which is a bunch of guides and checklists and different things to help you implement a Strong Towns approach in your community. All of that is free at strongtowns.org. So with that, I will pause. I see there are some questions, and
Thanks,
Allison's
Chuck.
going to come on and we're going to chat.
Yeah, we do have quite a few questions here in the questions panel. So we will start working our way through those. And as folks have more questions, feel free to type them in and we'll get to as many as we have time for. So I'll go ahead and get started. First off, Chuck, here's a question. How do we know if we're growing in a way that creates wealth versus creates liabilities for the future?
That's a really good question. And it actually has a very easy answer and then a very complicated answer. The easy answer is you have to actually do the math. You have to actually do the accounting. Take something as simple as a street. If we build a new street, we know what that street costs. And as an engineer, I can tell you how long it will last. And I can tell you what, roughly in today's dollars, the maintenance and replacement costs will be. That's not like a difficult thing to compute in any way. The problem is that we don't compute that. Like we actually don't, as cities, we actually don't do that math. And in fact, the counting processes that we have, basically, I was going to say require us, but it's not require. The standard accounting practices that cities are encouraged to use do not account for long-term liabilities in that way. And that's unfortunate. We're actually working to change that right now, change that process. That doesn't mean that cities can't do it voluntarily. Having an understanding of your liabilities and then actually accounting for your tax base that is created with that and doing that math is something that anybody can do, any community can do. We just don't have a history of doing it. These are not difficult math problems, really.
Okay. Here's a question that came in while you're showing the single family homes, sort of 1950s versus now, and the median income information. It says, understanding the relationship of increased resource per person, how do you address the change in household occupancy over time? As the number of persons per home decreased by more than half in my community, the number of homes is increasing for the same population.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy because it's another one of these factors. Since World War II, there's the end of World War II, the house size, the median house size in the U.S. has gone up, I want to say 3 times, 2.5 times. It's enormous. It's tremendous. And it's you know, compared to the rest of the world, which I don't always think is a fair comparison, but I think in this case, I've spent time in Europe and nobody in Europe lives destitute lives. Like they have very nice lives, but they do it in houses that are much more ornate and beautiful and well apportioned, like things are very nice, but they're smaller. We kind of have the bulk discount here. So we would rather have the 3,000 square foot house with the cheap sheetrock than the 1,500 square foot house with like the really nice granite things and that kind of stuff. Okay, that's the American approach. That's fine. Like I get it. We're not Europe. That being said, when you look at the strong towns narrative, the underlying issue here is that our houses have gotten bigger, our households have gotten smaller, our yards have gotten bigger, things have become more spread out. And what that means is that each individual or each smaller family unit is responsible, their wealth and their capacity and their like contribution to the economy you can think of is responsible for sustaining more and more and more. That works really well in the growth phase. It doesn't work very well in the kind of maintenance hanging on phase. And you can think of it this way, just in a personal sense. If you bought a house that was, let's not say you bought it, let's say you inherited a house that was way bigger than you needed, but it has a swimming pool, it has extra bedrooms, it's like really great. It's a really nice house. That place would be awesome, right? You'd move in and you'd be like, wow, look at all this room I've got. I've got a room for my room. Like I just got room. I got, I can do whatever I want. And it would be wonderful until like the bill came in to replace the roof. And then you'd find that like the roof repair bill was like more than your annual income. You're like, well, okay, this was not a great inheritance. Like this was not a good deal. Like I'm not better off here in this place. What is happening right now across the US in cities is that we have experienced, in a sense, the living large of being an American. We can have more space, more stuff, more yard, more this. And now we are experiencing the bill coming due in all these places. And we're like, whoa, wait a sec, what's going on? The family size just makes that harder. Let me, not to belabor it, but let me give you kind of the opposite side of this. I was able to spend some time in a city, Santa Ana, California. Santa Ana, California is, and I apologize if I don't know the exact right word today, but undocumented is a very high percentage of people who are not American citizens and are not here with like all the green card legalese that they're supposed to. It's in Southern California, it's south of LA. If you go to this community, what you see on paper is a place that is really poor. And house prices that are lower than what you see in other markets, even though California is crazy. When you start going around the neighborhoods, what you see is that their definition of a family is very different than what we have here in Brainerd, Minnesota. In Brainerd, Minnesota, we've evolved into the post-World War II definition of a family, which is mom and dad and however many kids. And when the kids are gone, it's just mom and dad and a massive house. In Santa Ana, a family is mom, dad, however many kids, the cousin who's here for the summer, the aunt and uncle who are between jobs, grandma and grandpa who we're taking care of and are helping out with the kids, and then a couple family friends who are in town for the summer. It's a very different thing. And the interesting thing is if you go back in that complex adaptive framework I showed you at the beginning and look at the way people treated families in the past, it was more like what you see in Santa Ana than what you see in the US today. And I think that gives us a little bit of a path towards making some of this stuff work better. Sorry, I went on too long with that answer, but I think it's an important insight.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple questions here about agricultural lands. How would you say landscape scale unfragmented agricultural lands fit into the strong town scenario? Do strong towns have any information on resources concerning agricultural land's role in having strong towns?
Yeah, it's a great question. Here's how I think we need to think about this. If you think of, if we put together a chart, I'm an engineer, so I like charts, I apologize. And on one end of the chart was urban cities, you know, like core downtown of a city. And on the other end was like a farm with a single house on a 2-tire lane dirt road. Both of these tend to be really financially productive, but for very different reasons. The urban city is financially productive because while you have a lot of public investment in roads and pipes and sewer systems and fire departments and all that, you also have a lot of tax base. And so there's a balance there between the tax base and the public side of the ledger. If you go to the farm or the very rural area, what you have is not much tax base on like a per foot basis. Like the land is worth a lot less. There's not a lot of, private investment. There might be private investment in the size and the scale of it, but like it's not there to be like wealth producing land. It's there to be a farm. And you wouldn't tax it or expect it to perform as well as like the downtown of the city. But you also don't have a lot of infrastructure. You've got a very modest road. It's very low volume. There's not a lot going on. I grew up on a farm, and I like to point out, we would call the sheriff if there was a problem, and maybe he'd show up 45 minutes later. If the barn caught on fire, there was no fire department that was ever going to get there in time to put it out before it went up. So we lived a very different life, and it was a life that we recognized was a low service kind of thing. When we got a big blizzard, you might not get out of there for a couple of days because you were not the first place that was going to be snowplowed. I think one of the things we've done, and again, we've done it for good reasons, but it's been a self-inflicted wound, is in conjunction with devaluing the core of the city and taking away that wealth, we have also added a lot of public expenses to what would otherwise be like low expense farmland. The family farm that I grew up on today that's still all there, 80-acre farm. It's still all there. Across the street from it now is a brand new middle school, and it has 1,200 feet of sewer and water and paved road in front of it. And so now all of a sudden the community, which has no tax base here because the school has no tax base at all, right? And my family farm, where my parents still live, is a farm with very low tax base, now has out in front of their house like $1.2 million of infrastructure. Okay, how do we pay for that? Like that doesn't make any sense. And so I think one of the things that we have done erroneously is we have brought a lot of the city out to the farm. And then we've also taken the farms and said, well, you should, for whatever reason, have nice paved roads, and you should have higher levels of service, and you should basically have a suburban kind of lifestyle experience. And while I get that, because I grew up on a farm and it was nice to have a paved road and it was crappy to have a dirt road, what happens is that the farm then has to become development, or the farm then gets pushed out of being a farm because you've changed the underlying economics of it in a way that it doesn't make sense. And that is really unhealthy long-term for everybody, because there's no way that those investments on the public side make sense and can pay for themselves. And when you try to put that burden on the farmer, there's no way that they continue to be a successful farmer while bearing that burden.
Okay, I have a couple questions from here in Bozeman, where we are, Future West. I'll start with this one. Okay, in particular with Bozeman, we have a high diversity of wildlife species here and in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. What are the best way to build livable cities and towns that are equitable, welcoming, and prosperous for all humans, while also protecting or preserving rare or superlative natural elements surrounding these places?
Well, I think if we could go back 20 years, it would be the same advice, or 50 years, it'd be the same advice, and would have a much, a more dramatic effect. But I think from this point on, we can latch onto this and I think start to see progress. The answer is very easy. It's make your cities into great cities and don't develop outside of your cities. I'll go back to this emaciated, body analogy again. If Bozeman, and we just go down the list of Western cities, if Bozeman never added another foot of pipe, another foot of road, another foot of sidewalk, you would still have, and I'm just going to throw out a number, 50% more than your tax base can sustain. You're still looking at a future where you're actually ultimately shrinking your size of your infrastructure investments. And so the idea that we would chew up wildlife habitat, chew up farmland, that we would degrade any of the surrounding natural environment in order to experience growth, that is literally like land we are conquering that we can't sustain. Like I say conquering, I feel like it's like an army conquers ground, but you get so spread out that you lose and you have to like fall back. That's what our cities are being forced to do because we can't sustain all of this infrastructure we built. So the way to preserve the habitat is to make your downtown awesome, to make the surrounding neighborhoods great places to be, to increase your population of your downtown by 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and the surrounding neighborhood over the next generation. I look at my neighborhood here. My city of Brainerd at the end of World War II was 13,500 people. Today, it is 13,500 people. So the same population, but we're 10 times the size. Okay. If we shrunk by 90% and had the same number of people, we would be what Brainerd was at the end of World War II. So let me put it this way. If we only shrunk by 80%, we would have double the amount of space and room and everything that people had at the end of World War II, when this was a pretty awesome city. Like I can look back at the photos and see the movie theaters and the restaurants and the hotels and like all the wonderful things in this town that were around then. We could have that and more on a footprint that was 20% the size of what we have today. I think that our goal should be, I think that our approach should be, we are not taking on any more liabilities by horizontally expanding. And we're going to put all of that effort and energy into improving the quality of life in our places, because that's where our new growth should go, is into thickening up.
So I have a couple questions here about zoning. What are the most effective changes a city can make to a zoning code immediately without a complete do-over, or is a do-over the thing to do first?
I'm going to recommend 2. The first is abolish all of your parking requirements. Never require someone to build parking, just period. Never require it. Stop doing it. The second thing would be to change your code to allow the next increment of development intensity in every neighborhood. So there should be no such thing as an exclusively single family neighborhood. Every single family neighborhood should be able to have a duplex instead of a single family home, at least. You should be able to, if you have a neighborhood where duplexes are allowed, you should be able to build 3-unit and 4-unit buildings. So go through your ordinance and basically anything that is stopping you from evolving to the next level of development intensity, remove that provision or change that provision to allow you that next evolutionary step.
Right. Where's everyone going to park? Doesn't everyone always say that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there's a presupposition in that question in that everyone is driving, right? So where is everyone going to park? Why does everyone have to drive to every single destination? I think we could start where we're at today and recognize that almost everybody drives to almost every destination. And that's really the answer to that question. And people can't perceive like how would this function any differently? But the reality is, if we went back, in Bozeman in particular, if you go back 60 years, is a very small percentage of the population that drove everywhere they went. Pretty much everybody walked everywhere they went. And so somehow over the course of 2 generations, we evolved from one to the other. I think that what we are going to do is we are going to evolve back to a situation where we don't, we have options for people in the framework for where so they don't have to drive to every single thing that they do. I live in a core neighborhood in my community. So I live 6 blocks from where I'm at right now. Another like 3 blocks that way is the core downtown. If you triangulate, I live like 5 blocks from downtown. I will go a month without getting in my car. Like I don't have to drive. Like I don't have to drive. I can drive, and I have a neighbor who works in the same building and he drives every day. But I walk and it takes me 12 minutes to get here, and I've, in pretty good shape because of it. And I like this lifestyle. If I went out to my brother who lives far out of town and drives a huge truck and said, "Hey dude, you're going to walk everywhere you go," he would say, "You're out of your mind. That's insane. I won't do it." Don't start with him. Don't start with my brother. Start with my neighbor. My neighbor is the guy that we work with. And if you go back to that 4-step approach, what you're doing is you're going and you're looking at the neighborhood and you're seeing like, why does this person who lives 6 blocks away from where he works, why is he not walking? What is stopping him from doing that? And part of it is lifestyle, right? He's just used to driving, so he drives everywhere. But part of it is that my neighborhood's not always great to walk in. And is there a way we can make that like slightly better and get this person walking? A lot of, let me say 2 more things about parking. A lot of replacing parking trips with walking and biking trips is about building a culture of biking and walking. It's about creating momentum around that. And once you start to create momentum around that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The other thing just to say about parking, and I think this is really important. When the question is, where will everybody park? That's like a question like, your house is on fire, it's burning down, and you're like, where will we throw the birthday party? And it's like, really, like, that's not the most important thing you have right now. Everywhere where you see parking in your community, everywhere where you see a parking lot, whether it's empty or whether it's full, and almost all of them are going to be empty almost all the time. What you are seeing is a public investment in a place that is producing nothing. Think of it as a farmer who is fertilizing, irrigating, doing, cultivating, doing everything in a field, but nothing grows at all. Over and over and over and over. That's what it is. And so you don't have the money, the wealth to just have parking lots all over the place. Every time you see one of those, imagine it's like a farmer who's taken half of their fields and just grown nothing, but put all of the work and energy and labor and capital into trying to grow something. We would call that farmer insane. If you actually go in Google Maps and look at your city and look at the amount of land devoted to parking, and then use your Strong Towns brain and think of all the pipe under the ground serving that, all the roadways serving that, all the sidewalks serving that, all the stuff serving that, it's insane. It financially makes 0 sense. And you can't do it. You can't, I guess I'm telling you that you can't afford it. And so I don't care where you're going to park. Like, that's not the big problem you have to solve. The big problem you have to solve is, why are we going bankrupt? And how do we fix that?
I have a couple questions about city and county cooperation. I'll go start with this one. No matter what a city does, they still have to contend with growth that a county is allowing to happen outside of city limits. Do you have any ideas for convincing a community to restrict growth outside of city limits? And maybe discuss a little bit about how cities and counties might work together.
Yeah. It is a bewildering proposition because counties, for the most part, especially in the West, and here in Minnesota, it's very similar. Counties get their revenue, like their business model is property tax and tax base. And for some reason, counties like lose their minds. They become fiscally like kind of borderline incapacitated when they think about this growth equation. Because if I put a $100,000 building within the city of Brainerd, or I put a $100,000 building outside of the city of Brainerd, the county gets the same amount of tax revenue. It's not like the county's take on this is any different. But the more we build outside of the city, the more liability the county assumes. So the more the county has to provide services, the more the county has pressure to have the sheriff go out there and resolve this and plow the snow off the roads and maintain the gravel and do all these other things. And so if you were running the county and saying like, I want to make sure the county's budget is really good, is really sound, is doing really well, the first policy you would do is say, all new growth and development needs to be within a municipality. It needs to be within a city, because then you're just growing tax base without growing expenses, right? Like now you are doing something really, really productive from a budget standpoint. None of them do this. They all do the opposite, which is they put themselves at like odds with the city and try to compete with the city and be like, well, if the city won't do that development, we'll do it out here, or we'll give you subsidies out here, or we'll find some way to have you do this out here because we're pro growth, pro jobs, pro whatever. You're also pro bankruptcy and pro high taxes and hurting financially your community if you do that. And I think that is a fallacy that counties need to get over really quickly. Let me say one thing about working together. I think that there is a natural human tendency, particularly among people with a nurturing kind of disposition, to think that we're all better off working together. And I think there's a reason for that, because like in a default sense, it's true, right? Like if we could have a situation where we all work together, it would be much better than a situation where we're all adversarial. But there's some nuance to that. If we're all working together on a bad business model, it doesn't matter that we're cooperative. It's not helping us at all. And in order for us to fix our business model so that our cities become financially strong and productive, it forces us to be a little bit rivalrous. You have a little bit of rivalry and contention with other governmental units that would want us to have a bad business model. I wouldn't do it with animus, and I wouldn't do it, to try to be provocative. But I personally think that cities and city governments have a responsibility to their citizens and their taxpayers and their residents to actually look out for the city first and not be cooperative in the sense that we're going to do things that are really damaging to our people just so we get along with the county or get along with the neighboring city. Let me give you one example. I think a lot of times we are induced to do, as cities, we are induced to do road projects that the state wants or the county wants, and we're induced to participate in those. We did one here in my city where the county came in, and it was a county road through the middle of the city. And the county comes in and says, you know what? We have projecting high traffic counts here, and we're going to take this and we're going to remove all the on-street parking, and we're going to make this a 3-lane kind of highway through the middle of town. We're going to close off some of the local streets, and we're going to make it, a very high capacity street through the middle of town. The city was forced to take money out of their budget to participate in this. The city had to do a bunch of things on their part to make this work. They were happy to do it, even though I was opposed to it. A bunch of people were opposed to it. And in the end of the day, we wound up through this cooperation with having a neighborhood disconnected basically by this moat of a road that runs through. The sidewalks are dangerous. There's been people now hit trying to cross this street. There's major crossings that now are just highway only. The on-street parking that used to provide a buffer to the people and their homes and the people walking is now gone. The traffic goes much more quickly through here. The speeds are way up. It's far more dangerous. And these are people's homes. We actually devalued their homes and their neighborhoods, made it less desirable places. We did all this in the name of cooperation. I think what should have been done is the exact opposite. Instead of making it easy for the person who lives 20 miles out of town to commute into a job in the middle of town, we should make it much easier for the person who lives in town to have a very high quality of life. And if that costs the person who chooses to live 20 miles out of town, an extra 2 minutes or 3 minutes on their commute, so be it. Like, that's a small price to pay for having a city that is a higher quality place to live and is financially, more successful and more productive. And if we make our place so wonderful to live, maybe that person who lives 20 miles out of town would decide that, you know what, the burden of living out here, the cost of living out here, the time it takes me living out here, I would rather live in this awesome city. So I'm going to move to town.
All right. Well, we have a couple more questions. Let's see. I think we have time for maybe one,
Sure.
maybe two more.
I'll try to go faster.
Yeah, this one maybe could be a quick answer. Do you have any examples of model zoning code language that reflects strong town principles, like some specific examples that communities could copy?
Well, it's not really what we do. No, let me answer this question in a way that I think is helpful, though. There's a group called the Form-Based Codes Institute, and they have lots of model codes. And I think if you were really into zoning and coding and like, this is what we want to do, I would start with them. I also would just recommend, the question earlier was about zoning reform. And I think there is a tendency amongst planners and people who, and I don't say this in a derogatory way, the bureaucratic inertia within government to do things in large increments. So let's do a comprehensive change to our zoning code. I have found that it is better to work small, incremental, pragmatic. So take your neighborhood where you're struggling, take the place where you have a difficult commercial residential interface where you're having tension, and go out and do your sample form-based code there and get it going in that neighborhood, and then be successful there, and then incrementally expand it to other parts of the city. Don't try to change everything all at once. Just deal with the tension and use that to kind of drive things. But the Form-Based Code Institute is really good. The Smart Code is also fantastic. These are two like model codes out there that I think would fill that gap that the question's asking.
Okay. And maybe this can be our last one. Can you comment on the tax-based shifts that might be occurring related to businesses in the city leaving because of shifts in working remotely?
Yeah.
So that's a quick question, but
no, it's really good. And it's multifaceted too. I would not want to be a major city reliant on office space right now. I mean, I do think that the New York Cities of the world, the San Francisco, those kind of places have a business model based around building office towers. And I think that business model is very much in question right now. Can it be adapted and change and all that? I think, yes, it can. But does the underlying financing of that model allow that to happen? I don't know. I really am suspect. If we get to cities that are the size of Bozeman, you have a little bit of that people have dabbled in, and there's a little bit of that outside financing coming in. But you also have, I think, what is the kind of knockoff effects, which these cities are becoming like, great places to be for people who want to do remote work. And so in a sense, like, will there be more demand in Bozeman than less because of remote work? I think you can make the case that there will be. Time will tell. I guess we don't really know. I do think that there is a niche right now for smaller towns that can offer really what kind of universally most people say they want. Not, I say that most people, there's some people who love Manhattan and love like large urban cities and urban life. Pretty much everyone who lives in suburbs, when you ask them what they want, the overwhelming disposition is they want small town life. And small town life is actually something that is captured in a small town, a downtown with like core neighborhoods. And that's what people are trying to recreate. I think there's an opportunity right now with people having more options for remote work for smaller towns, Bozeman and even much smaller, my town of 13,000. And even I was talking to a mayor today of a city of 3,000. I think there's an opportunity there to respond to that demand in a way that is, think of it this way. If you can have a family move to your community and they can live in a place where they can have one car and one person works remotely, you have economically transformed your community, because the cost of a car is like $8,000 a year. They're going to save that because they don't have to own two. They only have to own one. If they can live in a neighborhood where one person can work remotely and be able to walk and get to things, now you've created demand for your local businesses. You've created more demand in your economic ecosystem. You've also created rising property values, and you've done it on a framework that actually makes your city wealthier and creates that thickening up process. I think that's the sweet spot for the small towns today, is to try to capture that type of capital coming in and allow it to kind of stay in the community.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Chuck. We had a couple questions maybe we didn't get to, so I will try to send them by email. And
that'd be great.
Contact info up on the screen right now for folks who want to get in touch with either us at Future West or with Chuck. We have your email addresses up there. And I just want to let folks know that we do have a survey that will come up right after you close out of our webinar. And if you could give us some feedback, that will help inform our future webinars. And Randy, did you want to close things out for us?
Yes. Well, first, thank you, Allison. And thank you again so much, Chuck. You know, I don't know how many times I've heard you, a lot, I guess, listen to your podcast, but, you know, always something new comes through for me because I really do think about it. So we do appreciate it, and we appreciate all of you for joining us. Really love those questions. There's some really good questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but as Allison said, we'll be getting back to you. I will leave it with this then. You know, if you can, please join us for our next webinar next month. This one will address the question that was on the minds of some people today, based on the questions you were asking. And that is the impact of rural real estate development on farm and ranch lands in the Northern Rockies. We'll feature some case studies from counties and landowners who've taken really effective, proactive steps to conserve the rural landscape and maintain agriculture as part of that landscape. So with that, we'll be reaching out to you all to let you know more details on the next webinar. And until then, get out there, enjoy this warmer weather, and try to notice ways that you can make your community incrementally a better, stronger town. Thank you much, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.